And I think a lot of stuff does get debated that does actually matter in the end. And I mean, the growth of Davos is just a phenomenal story in a way. If you look at the stuff that they covered just in a few days, it was pretty extraordinary. I think it's always good when the two worlds, you talk about business, politics, celebrity, but I think when the business world and the political world get together, and part of the job, I think, now of politics and business is to look at trends and to see what they think is happening more generally on a global strategic level, not just within the narrow confines of country A or country B or business A or business B.
Davos is clearly one of the highlights in the calendar, and I think it gives a good lens into the way that the global elite think. I think it's always about what's current, what's coming. So current events were clearly discussed. Top of those have got to be the ramifications of the war in Syria, the opening up of Iran. On the one hand, the prospect of US tapering, the state of the global economy.
I think the most interesting thing about Davos was the points it didn't raise, the things it didn't talk about, and in particular didn't talk about really technology. So we live in, we often think about geopolitics or geoeconomics as ways of looking at the world, but really there wasn't much of a discussion. There was hints of it, but not very much about geotechnology. And we live in a constantly geotechnical age, whether that's the crossbow or the steamship or the internet. But the fact is technology is now moving so fast that the gap between technology and how we organise ourselves is getting painfully wide. And I don't really think that was addressed in any meaningful form at Davos.
I think this year, even more than previous years, there was a sense that the economic voices were the ones that people wanted to hear. Those people who you felt had a real insight into the changes that were taking place.
Well, I think you have to be positive. The economy is, after all, picking up after nearly 2 recessions. I think one had a bit recession, I'd call it. The second one wasn't that deep. The first one was deep enough when the economy contracted by over 6%. So after 5 years of no growth, some growth is good news, and it looks like it should be consistent, so you have to be positive. Confidence is picking up. We mustn't get too complacent, because it's not yet the case that it's firing on all cylinders, and more needs to be done to make sure that it's sustainable. But I think it's fantastic news that after a period of no growth, we had a bit of growth in 2012, and then we had a bit more in 2013, and it looks like we'll have a bit more than that in 2014, so that's got to be good news.
I always feel positive about the UK because I'm very British, but I do worry about Britain at the moment. I worry about what's happening in relation to the debate in Scotland with the referendum, because although the polls are all pointing, as it were, from my perspective, in the right direction, i.e. against independence, I don't think it can be taken for granted. And I worry about the debate in relation to Europe. So I think there's lots of good stuff going on in Britain. I think culturally we're still very, very strong. I think that there's a sense that Britain, hate to talk about countries as brands, but the British brand that is still very, very strong, very, very powerful. But I don't think the economy is in that great shape in terms of how people feel in their living standards, and I do worry about these two big unsettled questions.
Well, over the past year, if you look at the breakdown of the expenditure measure of GDP, then the growth drivers have been the traditional ones. It's been consumer-led, it's been some government spending, it's been an increase in stocks. Business investment actually fell, and net trade detracted from growth. So it's been a reliance on domestic demand. In particular, it's on households. And I think that's where potentially some of the vulnerability comes in. So in the medium term, the UK does have a challenge. Growth has to rebalance. It must move away from domestic demand and debt towards supply, manufacturing, and meeting overseas demand. But that's a tough transition, and it hasn't done that yet, because we talked a lot about growth having to come from these sources, but actually growth came from the old traditional sources, which is domestic demand and consumer spending and a bit of an increase in debt. I think it's clear that the global economy is recovering. The recovery has been led by the advanced economies for a change. So on our forecast, my expectations for 2014 is that the advanced economies will grow by about 2%. Now that's not a lot, but it's 1% more than it did in 2013. Overall, global growth will be around 3.5% this year after around 3% last year. That's a decent rate of global growth. It's not too far from the long-run trend, and in an upswing, it should be growing much more rapidly, but at least it's beginning to expand.
Technology is neither a threat to jobs nor a savior of it. What it actually is a mirror to society. And the interesting thing about what's happening with technology now is it's moving so fast, it's starting to push our buttons and ask us real important questions about who we want to be as a society. I mean, John C.D. Brown, who's somebody I respect a lot as one of the architects of the digital revolution, says that actually working out what the job will be in the next 20 years is one of the most important questions for society. Bill Gates said something I think very wise, which he said we always overestimate what will happen in 2 years and we always underestimate what will happen in a decade. I don't think anybody can predict how technology will affect the economy. We are very bad at predicting the future. And anybody who says they can, I think, is pretty arrogant. I mean, you can see first-order effects of technologies. If you see the internet, you can pretty much work out the emails coming. But do you see social media? Do you see the use of social media in changing the relationship between stakeholders? No, not really. And, famous predictions, man will not fly for 50 years, Wilbur Wright. I mean, he was building an aeroplane at the time. And the famous one, I think there's a world market for 5 computers from Thomas Watson, the chairman of IBM. And these are people who should know. So I don't think you can predict how these things will affect the economy. What you can do is be awake at the wheel. So when the changes in the road come, you're at least awake in front of that steering wheel, rather than many of our organisations who are currently asleep and will go off the cliff, just as they did in the Industrial Revolution and the Agricultural Revolution before that. If I was in charge of the itinerary for Davos next year, I have no idea what the first topic on my agenda would be. What I would do is ask a whole bunch of stakeholders what their frequently unasked questions are and their frequently unanswered questions. I think there were a lot of questions that weren't even asked at Davos that were important, and certainly a lot that were kind of posed but weren't really answered. And I think if you curate any event around the unasked and unanswered questions, you get a much more interesting debate going on.
I think it would be good if they could have bigger themes they do have big themes, they set big themes, but then inevitably, because so many big people from politics and big people from business arrive, and then they just kind of do their own thing and they use it as a platform for themselves. And I think if there was a theme that I would like to see more, it is about the disparity now between rich and poor, not just within countries but also between countries.
I think for a 2015 Davos, top of my agenda would be the state of the emerging economies and whether they've adjusted to some of the challenges that they face. The easy part of growth is now over. The tough part is structural reforms, making themselves much more able to maintain growth into the medium term for the good of everyone.